I sat in a single-room shack with a candle in front of me. The flame flickered as small gusts of wind came through the gaps in the boards that held the ramshackle walls in place. I could hear it stomping around outside. Its massive form moved through the brush and brambles effortlessly. As it crashed through snapped limbs and torn vines, I huddled near the candle. If I could make it to morning, I would be fine. It wouldn't go near the light. The candle gave off just enough light to illuminate the room. Even still, shadows danced at the edge of the light. They twisted and contorted into shapes that were foreign to my concept of reality. They almost looked like faces. It was supposed to be a simple hike. My manager announced that we'd be taking part in a team-building exercise at the land between the Lakes National Recreation Area. We set out from the Visitors Center in a van toward Jenny Creek Campground. Upon reaching the campground, we piled out and toward the edge of the woods. Christopher, our guide, led us along the edge of the creek and up the hill for the better part of a few miles. There were about 14 of us at that time. The guide would stop every so often to tell a story about a local plant or point out a wild animal. I was walking to the rear of the pack. I couldn't make out most of what he was saying. We'd been on the trail for the better part of 2 hours when I heard the crack of thunder in the distance. No one seemed to notice. It was a particularly cool September afternoon, and I wasn't in a hurry to walk a couple of miles in the rain. I ended up tapping the woman directly in front of me on the shoulder. "Hey, Miriam, did you hear that thunder?" Miriam stopped and shook her head. In just the few seconds it took for that little exchange, the rest of the group disappeared around a bend in the trail. Miriam ran ahead to catch up, and I followed right behind her. We cleared the bend, and the rest of the group was nowhere to be found. Miriam stopped and shouted, "Where the hell are you guys?" She ran a bit further down the trail and then shouted again, "This isn't funny. Where is everyone?" The thunder cracked again and she shuddered. I can only assume that she heard it too. She was a bit ahead of me, so I yelled out to her, "Hey, let's just head back to the van and wait for them." Miriam turned to face me. She was a pretty girl. I'm pretty sure she worked over in accounting. She wore a pink mesh backpack on her shoulders to complement a purple tank top and jean shorts. Her look of frustration shifted to one of surrender as she walked towards me. I stood there as she pushed past me and said, "Screw it. Let's try to get back before it starts raining." I followed Miriam for about an hour before realizing something was wrong. We should have been near the edge of the creek, but we were still surrounded by dense forest. I didn't bother saying anything to Miriam. I'm not an outdoorsman by any means, and it was possible that I was just confused. We walked for another hour before I stopped her and asked, "Are you sure we're heading in the right direction?" Miriam responded, "Well, there's only one trail, so I'm pretty sure we just head back, right?" I nodded. She leaned up against a tree and said, "I'm getting tired. Want to build a fire or something?" We gathered a few dry pieces of wood and some dry leaves into a pile. Miriam laughed and rearranged them into something that resembled the functioning campfire. We sat on the ground near the fire and figured the rest of the group would catch up to us eventually. The thunder cracked again, but as far as I could tell, the sky was clear. I pulled a flask of bourbon from my day bag and offered it to Miriam, and she took a swig and made a face like she just licked a battery. Sorry, not everyone's ready for Basil Hayden's bourbon. She coughed and replied, Bourbon? Who brings bourbon on a hike? I laughed and said, Well, the same guy that brought a joint. Miriam smiled, and we sat by the fire passing it as the sky began to grow dim. She occasionally added a new piece of wood to the fire as I watched the end of a stick I was holding slowly burn. At some point, she laid beside me using her bag as a pillow. Not being completely dense, I did the same, and we lay there in each other's arms next to the fire as I drifted off to sleep. I woke an inordinate amount of time later. The sound of thunder cracked a lot closer than it had before. Miriam was no longer in my arms. Her bag was still beside me, but she seemed to have wandered off. The fire had been reduced to glowing embers. I tossed a few leaves and branches, and the flames started back up for a minute, but quickly died down to a dim glow. I could hear movement in the woods. Someone was walking slowly toward the fire. I hoped that it was Miriam, but part of me went rigid with fear. A small figure slowly came into focus as it approached the flame. It wasn't Miriam. It was Dave, a guy that worked with me on the shipping dock. Dave stumbled over to the fire and collapsed. His forearms and face were scratched up and covered in dried blood. His face had a blank expression that was a bit too eerie for me. I offered him my flask, and he proceeded to kill the bourbon right there without flinching. He handed it back to me and said, "Oh, hello. I'm surprised you made it." His voice was almost monotone. His facial expression was deadpan. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, it chilled me to the bone. I stood up and asked, "What do you mean, made it?" He looked up at me with a blank stare. At that moment, I heard another crash of thunder in the distance, followed by a woman screaming. It was Miriam. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and turned on the flashlight app. With a small device in front of me, I ran toward the source of the noise. The occasional stray branch or spiderweb would hit my face, but I soldiered on. Miriam needed me. The woods seemed to become denser and harder to push through as I continued on. I turned to go back to the trail and noticed I couldn't see the fire in the distance. The foliage around me was thick and unforgiving. I moved a bit slower from that point, and still in the general direction of Miriam's occasional screams. Eventually, I came to a clearing. The grass was about waist high. In the distance, I could make out something vaguely purple in the glow of the flashlight. I ran toward it to see Miriam leaning against a small tree. As I neared her, she came around with a large stick that she swung toward me. The wood struck me across the chest and I hit the ground. I let out a shout and screamed, "Damn it!" My phone flew to the side. Miriam crouched over me and said, "We need to get out of here, now." There was a crack of thunder and she went rigid. Several large trees fell into the clearing. I rolled over in pain and reached for my phone. As I turned it toward the falling trees, I caught a glimpse of something moving towards us with incredible speed. It seemed to dart away from the beam faster than I could move my phone. Miriam screamed for less than a second and then went silent. I turned the beam toward her and saw an impossibly black appendage sizzling in the light. The creature was attached to look like a cross between a gorilla and a large dog. Its eyes were as pitch black as the fur that was burning away in the light. It pulled its arm from Miriam and darted into the trees. I tried to follow it with a light, but it was too fast. As it moved farther into the distance, I heard a crack of thunder. Miriam lay dead at my feet as I reached for the large stick she'd used to knock me to the ground. There was nothing I could do for her. The hole in her torso had stopped gushing blood, and the color had left her face. I reached down and closed her eyes before running in the opposite direction of the creature. Eventually, somewhere along the way, I lost my phone. I crashed to the ground after tripping on something slick, and it slid away from my hand. I heard the splintering of wood and crashing thunder behind me and didn't stop to pick it up. I ran until my legs felt like jello. My face and forearms were covered in small scratches and dried blood. I was ready to keel over when I found the small shack at the edge of the woods. The building looked like it had been cobbled together from scrap metal and old wood. Inside was an old table and a metal chair. There was a small box of emergency candles on the table. I opened it to reveal a single candle. Shit. I sat in the single-room shack with the candle in front of me. The flame flickered as small gusts of wind came through the gaps in the boards that held the ramshackle walls in place. I could hear it stomping around outside. Its massive form moved through the brush and brambles effortlessly. As it crashed through snapped limbs and torn vines, I huddled near the candle. If I could make it to morning, I would be fine. It wouldn't go near the light. The candle gave off just enough light to illuminate the room. Even still, shadows danced at the edge of the light. They twisted and contorted into shapes that scared the shit out of me. Slowly, the shadows formed into faces. The faces on the wall moved as if they were trying to say something. The tiny mouths created from the shades of darkness danced with the flickering of the light to create a silent chorus of chatter I could neither hear nor understand. The creature outside would move toward the shack and retreat when they hit the dim light that escaped the cracks in the walls. The wind howled through gaps in the wall at just the right time for the mouth of the shadow behind it to form the word, "Run," in a raspy tone. A chill ran down my spine as the voice spoke again. I watched as the face in the wall mouthed the words, "The light isn't enough. You need to run." In that moment, the wind whipping through the gaps in the wall whispered in the same voice I'd heard before fading to sleep earlier in the night. It sounded like Miriam. I called out to the face and said, "I'm so sorry, Miriam. Please." I wasn't able to finish my sentence. A black hand punched through the boards. I jumped back and crashed through the opposite wall. The creature climbed through the remnants of the shack as I stumbled to my feet and took off running in the other direction. By the time I had made it to the road, I was in shambles. I ran down the road until I collapsed into a crawl. The blue light of early morning faded into the yellow gold of sunlight as I passed out from exhaustion in the middle of the road. A park ranger poked my shoulder with his walking stick as I shot up in panic. My face and forearms were caked in dried blood and covered in cuts. As I rambled about a monster in the woods, he ushered me into the front seat of his pickup truck and drove me to the ranger station as he radioed ahead for assistance. The ambulance was already there by the time we arrived. I was held overnight for observation before being sent home. I don't know what I expected when I showed up to work the following Monday, but it wasn't my manager asking, "Hey man, why didn't you show up to the team building exercise?" I looked at him blankly and said with contempt, "See these bandages? Park Ranger found me on the side of the road. You assholes left us behind, and Miriam dead. God knows where Dave is." My manager laughed and said, "Hey Dave, you hear this?" Dave walked over with his coffee mug and said, "Who's Miriam?" I stared at Dave. His forearm had been bandaged up. I asked, "What happened to your arm, Dave?" He laughed and said, "Oh, this? Yeah, I burned my arm Friday night." His eyes perked up and he ran to his desk. When he returned, he was holding my phone. Dave handed it to me and said, "I found this in the van. You should be more careful." I had dropped my phone in the woods. Dave had a burn on his arm. I didn't take the time to think or process. I lunged for Dave and tackled him to the ground as I threw punch after punch toward his face. Eventually, several coworkers pulled me off of him. As security escorted me from the room, I looked back to Dave and my manager as they smiled at me with those same jet black eyes I had seen in the woods.